as part of the Royal Society of Edinburgh's constitutional features work, I spoke on issues of fiscal powers and fiscal risks in the devolved nations. In the early years of devolution, the fiscal powers of the devolved nations were limited. But since then, increased spending, tax and borrowing powers have given both the Scottish and Welsh parliaments control over crucial elements of income tax alongside other devolved taxes. And here in Scotland, over £16 billion of devolved taxes will flow to the Scottish budget next year. And at the same time, Holyrood is also taking on responsibility for Social Security. So around £6 billion of Social Security payments will be coming on stream over the next few years. And in Northern Ireland, a recent Fiscal Commission report renewed calls for tax devolution if and when the Assembly is reconvened. And of course, there are calls too through the Levelling Up agenda for devolution to English regions and English cities. Now, debates over fiscal devolution have typically been motivated by arguments over improved accountability and autonomy. And in autonomy, there is evidence that we do see different policy agendas in the Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish administrations, particularly the margin. We've seen that on variations on things like income tax and land and buildings transaction tax here in Scotland. On accountability, I think the jury is still very much out. In work with Stuart McIntyre from Strathclyde and James Mitchell from Edinburgh, we looked at the extent of improvements in budget scrutiny and therefore financial accountability following the big fiscal reforms here in Scotland. And it's fair to say that the evidence was mixed. So we found evidence that scrutiny had become broader and debates in areas such as tax had been quite positive. We also found it was maybe perhaps less incisive than it had been previously when the budget was perhaps more simple and straightforward. There was no one really following the money, particularly through the scrutiny stages within Parliament in a strategic sense, and people generally found the overall framework we now have to be complex and difficult to follow. There's questions about power imbalance between resources for government and those doing the scrutiny within Parliament and outside. Now, one thing that wasn't really discussed during the big debates over fiscal devolution for Scotland and Wales was the issue of fiscal risk and transferring of risk, how and who was going to manage these risks in the short run and the long run. And it's been less of the key debates that we've had. But I think that's a mistake, because I think that it's really important to think about risks and how they're going to be managed. And the fundamental question in devolution is who should manage that risk and where should the balance of this rely? Should it be the UK government? Should it be devolved administration? Should it be sharing of risks across nations and regions of the UK? I think there's three issues worth highlighting. Firstly, there's the issue of what's happening in the short run around risks and who's managing them. And since 2016, we've seen the Scottish Government face a challenging net income tax position relative to perhaps where they would have hoped it would have been. So they're increasing taxation, increasing revenues, particularly trying to raise revenues from those on higher earners. But so far, we've seen that the amount they've collected has been slightly smaller than they would otherwise have hoped that would have been the case. And one of the questions from that is, who bears the risk of that and where have these risks come from? And one of the things that we're seeing is the Scottish economy has performed slightly more slowly, grown slightly more slowly than the rest of the UK over the last few years. But a key reason for that has been challenges in the North Sea. So issues in the North Sea and changes in the oil price, changes in investment sentiment in oil and gas, spilling over into potentially devolved tax revenues. And the question is, well, how much of that risk can the Scottish Government control? How much of that risk can they manage? And is the right balance there in terms of managing that risk? In Wales, the net tax position has been positive. So they've got upside risk and how they're thinking about how they manage that potential short-term boost to the budget that they're receiving. So risk is inherent into fiscal devolution, get to the heart of fiscal accountability. The key question is who is managing that risk and where do these risks focus and lie upon? And I think one key takeaway from that is the importance of the laser-like focus on economic growth and the laser-like focus on thinking about where your taxation is coming from. Now, there's a big debate about well-being economy, about the nature of growth in your economy and tackling inequalities, and all that is really important. But from a quite narrow fiscal framework point of view, what really matters here is that relative performance in the economy and that relative performance in earnings growth and income growth, and that is crucial to finding out whether the Scottish budget is better or worse off. And it gets to the heart of how you do policy, about how you evaluate policy, about how you track whether or not your policies are having that positive impact on the economy that you would potentially hope would be the case. Second risk really is around the management of day-to-day fiscal policy. And the fiscal framework for the Scottish Government is currently under review. And one of the things that people are looking at is that the powers to manage day-to-day financial risk, including borrowing powers, including how much you can save year on year. And this is something which at the time of the fiscal framework, it was very much a new agenda. We hadn't really done this in the context of the UK before. And I think the time is now right to look back at that. Are the arrangements in place appropriate? Are the limits appropriate? And where might additional flexibilities be used? And to give you an example of that, the borrowing power limits for the Scottish budget and the Scottish Government are set and fixed in cash terms. These were fixed in 2016, and we've also seen high inflation since then. So the actual value of the limit of the borrowing powers has fallen by about 20% simply because of the effects of inflation. And we've also seen a big increase in spending too, which has in turn meant that the amount of the budget you're trying to manage through these borrowing and saving powers has now got that bit bigger, but the actual mechanisms you've got have stayed the same here. So I think there's some really genuine questions, not about more powers, but actually just about the flexibility within the existing powers that you have. But finally, and most importantly, I think one of the big risks that we need to think about is this idea of long-term fiscal sustainability. And we published in the Scottish Fiscal Commission our first fiscal sustainability report for Scotland at the end of March. And in there's some really quite big challenges about how we, in terms of delivering public services, in terms of managing the public finances, respond to twin challenges of rising costs in public service delivery, but also an ageing population. I should say that the challenges that Scotland faces here are no different from the challenges that most high-income economies around the world face. But that's not an excuse not to think about how we manage these risks and how we can potentially get ahead of these challenges. And we've spoken about issues around demographics for a number of years now in Scotland. Christie Commission over 10 years ago had a lot to say about the challenges potentially coming down the line from demographics and the need to shift to prevention, need to shift to new types of public service delivery. And again, our report really emphasises a lot of the key conclusions there. Our population is ageing on average, and it's ageing quite rapidly. So in 1997, 16% of our population was aged 65 and above. That's 20% today, and it will soon rise over the coming decades to over 30%. Now, the fact that we're living longer and the fact that more of us are living longer is one of the great successes of economic prosperity and the growth we've seen through the 20th century and the early 21st century. But it comes with a fiscal cost. It means higher demand for key elements of public services such as health. Probably means that we're going to be raising less tax revenues as we have a smaller relative working age population. And then big questions about how we manage fiscal risk in a devolved context. Where does that balance lie between the UK and Scotland? And when we're thinking about debates over constitutional reform and more powers, if that's where we want to head, a key question for me is, how do you balance risks and who is going to be responsible for risks? And how do you, if risks are going to be shared, have clear levels of accountability in how you manage that risk? I hope this has been helpful. I hope this has been useful, and it gives you a flavour of the conversation that we had at the Royal Society of Edinburgh, looking at issues of fiscal reform and the constitutional context.